And now, this is our special plenary session. It's going to be moderated by AGS Council Member Dr. Antoinette WinklerPrins, who is the Director of Environmental Programs at the Johns Hopkins University. Antoinette?
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had a good break, and welcome back. We're talking about sustainable cities, and yet I have heard not a word about food yet. That is about to change. You cannot have a sustainable city without thinking about how you get the food into the city for people to eat. For many people, however, the term urban and agriculture do not typically go together. Agriculture has traditionally been done outside the city. In fact, it almost defined city, and outside the city, rural, where agriculture was done. But here in the early part of the 21st century, when over half the world's population lives in cities, and that percentage is growing, time has come to explore ways that agriculture can be practiced in the city. In reality, it always has, with victory gardens in the US and allotments in Europe, and people growing things in backyards. Food has always been grown in cities and continues to be done so in the developing world and in the developed world. But these practices are often seen as supplemental to the main flow of food into cities, or as something to make do as a society is undergoing some sort of crisis, a war, an economic downturn, or rapid urban transition, as is the case in so many developing countries where recently arrived rural urban migrants are practicing forms of urban agriculture as simply a means of getting food to themselves. But the norm still in most of our ways of thinking is that agriculture is separated from urban life. With the recent turn towards attention to relocalizing food production, the movement for urban agriculture is strong throughout the world, and its benefits are not just for food security, but also for greening the city and sustainability. You might have noticed just outside the door here is a farmer's market at Columbia, bringing locally or regionally produced food into the city for people to purchase. The interest in food that is grown within a certain distance from where you live has really increased for many reasons, both environmental and health, and sense of community and sense of getting away from very long and complex global supply chains. Around the world, rooftops and empty lots, berms and yards and parks and community gardens are all being rethought as to become productive pieces of the landscape, growing crops for those around it. But realistically, even if all land that was available or rooftops in cities were to be cultivated, it would not produce enough food to feed everyone in those cities. So we would need to continue to rely on the large-scale industrial production of food that occurs in ever far away hinterlands. Those forms of large-scale agriculture are increasingly seen as environmentally destructive and energy inefficient. And there's a general concern that the world is running out of arable land. It is certainly running out of high-quality land. That's where vertical farming comes in. By completely rethinking how food could be produced in cities, in buildings using efficient technology, Dr. Dickson Despommier's work has been at the cutting edge of thinking about large-scale food production in cities. I'm therefore thrilled to introduce our plenary speaker today, who will be describing to us his ideas of vertical farming. And I show you here his book, which we'll put on the list for Chris's book list for future urban form. Dr. Despommier is an emeritus professor here at Columbia University, where he spent 38 years as a professor of microbiology and public health in the environmental health sciences program. He has won the Best Teacher Award 6 times and was awarded a Golden Apple Award by the American Medical Student Association. But in the last decade or so, he's been working very actively on ideas that were first came together in his class in medical ecology. And together with his students, he's been promoting the ideas that he's going to be sharing with us today. So without further ado, let us listen to Dr. Despommier and his ideas on how we can feed the cities of the future and restore degraded hinterlands in the process.
Thank you. First, thank you, Antoinette, for that kind introduction, and also to Christopher Tucker for even having the courage to invite me here today to sort of give you a different take on how I, as a non-urbanist, but as a microbiologist by training, but always interested in food supply and food safety, because I worked on a parasite which actually was transmitted through the ingestion of raw or undercooked meat. Trichinosis was my organism, and I spent some 28 years in the laboratory trying to figure out how that little beast made its living. Unsuccessfully, I might say. So this idea arose indeed in a classroom, and that classroom was an outgrowth of the fact that I no longer had federal support for my research. So I had to search around for another activity, and I love teaching, as you gathered. And so why not teach something that relates to what I was doing, but on a global scale? So instead of looking through a microscope, I decided to look through a telescope instead. And so looking through the telescope, not just a quest star to look at the stars, but to look at the lay of the land, so to speak, and to get more involved in global issues that related to public health. This idea, unlike many others that occur in classrooms around the world, actually escaped into the real world and is now, as you will find out over the next 30 minutes or so, a viable way of looking at food production in urban centers. So the title is kind of global, saying that we could contemplate building structures inside of which we grow food in energy efficient ways and allow people living in the local area to share that food. In fact, we would invite them to work in those buildings and take some home with them every night when they go home for dinner. So I know this is impossible to read because I was sitting in the audience and I couldn't read the slides, but I could get the feeling of those slides. And so here's just a summary of the Ipcc to let you know that science is not a belief system. So whether you believe in climate change or not is irrelevant. The data is very strongly in favor of the fact that not only is the climate changing, which is one of the ways of characterizing Earth, but also that it's changing more rapidly than it has in the past. And perhaps we're responsible for that increase in rate of change. And just to reiterate what everybody else has been saying, of course, but with real data this time, you can actually see this temperature profile of Earth as it has accelerated over the last 50 to 100 years. And that's also coincident with the rise in CO2 levels and methane and nitric oxide in our atmosphere. So those are the greenhouse gases that we're mostly worried about. And a change in climate has a huge effect on outdoor farming, as you might imagine. And in doing so, it has affected where you can farm. So that's a geographic problem. If you had maps showing where corn is grown throughout the world, and wheat, and rice, and barley, and millet, and quinoa, and kale, I can't say quinoa without saying kale. So you get a map, a snapshot in time of where the conditions are right or where we have forced the issue to grow our food. But this is such a rapidly changing environment that indeed those maps, instead of being time frames, they should be continuous analog movies so that you can actually watch it happen. And now that we have 8 Landsat photographing our Earth, these satellites are taking a picture about every 20 minutes. So there's no way to hide anymore. And we're up to Landsat 8. And I'm sure we'll go into the future of Landsat 20, who knows what, with different remote sensing devices to let us know everything we can about our changing environment. And indeed, it all relates to where you can grow food and what kind of food you can grow. We've hit this to death almost, emphasizing the fact that a lot of us choose to live in cities or must live in cities because there's nothing left for us to do in the countryside. And indeed, if you look in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, and in China, the urbanization process there is not a voluntary one, but rather it's predicated on the fact that a lot of farms in those areas are failing, and these people are seeking refuge in large, unmanageable, chaotic-like cities, hoping for a better future, and not finding it. So now I will challenge you to associate with this fantastic modern thinker. Janine Benyus has championed a concept that began back in the days of Leonardo da Vinci, and that is to take lessons from nature and to apply them to modern situations. The best way I can rephrase this from an ecological standpoint, because after all, the subject that I was working on for 28 years in the laboratory had an ecological relationship to the way the food was raised and brought to the table, and then the medical problems that arose after that. So there was an entire ecology of that too. An ecologist by the name of Howard Odum, whose brother was even more famous and worked at the University of Georgia, Eugene Odum, and some of you may know that person. They're both deceased now, unfortunately. Howard Odum was famous for saying, nature has all the answers. So what's your question? Best way to put it, the best way to put it. So Janine Benyus says, well, can we engineer, using modern technologies, an urban environment for millions of people that reflects in function the way an intact ecosystem currently functions? Can we achieve balanced lives in our built environment in a way that does not affect the outside world? Can we create resources for ourselves which do not impact negatively on the rest of the DNA molecule, so to speak? And of course, anytime you ask a question, you have to answer it. And so certainly we can. The point is, do we want to? So the reasons why we might want to, though, reflect ecological process. In a modern ecological talk on, let's say, forest ecology, you're familiar with all of the cycles that occur between absorbing sunlight by the plants and being fed upon by all the animal species that live in that habitat or environment or ecosystem or biome, whichever word you prefer. And how life and death sort of fosters more life and death, basically. That's all it's about, just passing DNA forward in its various forms to keep up with the environmental changes that have occurred over the billion or so years that, maybe 600 million years that we've had functional ecosystems on this planet. Cycles are what it's all about, but if we live in the built environment, it's resources in, use up what you can, and then discard what you can't use. And that's a linear process which has great negative ramifications for life on Earth as we know it, and certainly for our health and for the other DNA molecule holders out there, the stakeholders for planet Earth. So this is just a basic diagram of all of that and how it works. But if you had to characterize an ecosystem, here are the words that you would use. It's biodiverse, it's integrated, it's certainly sustainable because of that. And if you damage it, it can repair itself. It's resilient. On the other hand, cities, and you might recognize this city, one of the great cities of the world. Remember what I did for a living? Cities are Earth's largest parasites. So if we could turn the lights out on the stage just for a moment, the ones that point to the board is the one yeah. So, there's a little saying that Sarah Palin, I guess, popularized. I can see Russia from my house. Well, I can paraphrase that back in the other way. I can see Sarah Palin's house from outer space. And the reason why I can see it is because she uses electricity. And so if you really want to know about density of populations, all you have to do is turn out the lights. And there we are. We've created tangles of associations with regards to our social systems without coming to grips with our relationship between us in the built environment and the rest of the natural world. We've sort of just gone down the road of progress, creating more and more complex environments for ourselves, temperature-controlled cars that have 2 different temperatures for the passenger and the driver. Apparently, we're going to have to do it for no driver after a while. But that's okay. I can still get used to that. I just don't want to look out the windows, that's all. An autonomous car right now just doesn't appeal to me, but it will in the future, I'm sure. But we haven't given a single thought to all of the ecological damage that we've incurred along the way, particularly with regards to our own well-being, until very recently. Until we could look at the situation from afar, namely from 300 miles up, from remote sensing. That's where we get most of our good ideas from. And if you've ever talked to a former astronaut, and I've had the pleasure of talking to many, every one of them comes back and wants to do something to improve planet Earth. They don't want to go to Mars. They've seen Mars, that's fine. You know, and Elton John tells us it's cold as hell anyway, and you'd never want to raise your kids there. So that's fine. But we do want to live on this planet, and we do want to live in balance with not just each other, but also with everything else, whether we say that or not. That's why we take vacations to natural places. So if we're going to construct an ecologically sound city, let's start with these 3 basic elements. And in fact, I should have put water first, because without water, you don't have life, right? So you're going to go off the grid. Let's start with the energy paradigm. We get a lot of energy from the sun. I mean, we get a lot of energy from the sun. That drives life on Earth. That's the whole process of photosynthesis. But we're very slow at catching on to those things. You know, we can capture a lot of sunlight now. And in fact, you know what country leads the world in solar technologies, right? China might sell a lot of solar panels, but Germany produces the best solar panels. And they have a huge social program to introduce them to everybody in that country. They want to lower their carbon footprint to 0. And they're making solar panels part of that formula. And they're not charging you if you use them. They're actually giving you rebates on your taxes if you elect to put them on your house. We have lots of other energy sources too. Some of them are more damaging than others, particularly fossil fuels. We all know about that. Even nuclear power has its drawbacks, as we'll see in a minute. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because we've had some dramatic advances over the last several years, which have allowed us to contemplate getting all of our energy from passive sources. That solar event that you see up at the top is in Arizona. And there are 3 of those there now. It was a copy from the one in Spain. And that solar collector supplies enough electricity, at least it's their intent, from those 3 solar collectors to fuel fully about 250,000 homes. That's a remarkable advance, considering that 10 years ago, that would have been laughed off of anyone's agenda for a business model. Wind power. I just got back from a meeting in Copenhagen. There are energy collectives there. That is to say, you could form collectives from tables that you can see next to you, pool your money together, go to a bank, get a loan for a windmill, place it where you want that windmill to go, and you can sell the energy to the national grid. And the energy that you use is far less than the amount of energy that that windmill would generate. So collectively, there are about 3,000 energy collectives now throughout Europe, and most of them are in Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Holland. But the times, they are a-changing. And that will happen here too, because the answer is blowing in the wind. Thank you. So geothermal is another major source of energy, depending on where you live, and certainly if you live in Iceland, you have a little bit too much geothermal energy. Every now and then the thing explodes and you have to get out of its way, because they're right on the mid-Atlantic ridge of 2 tectonic plates. But they get most or all of their energy free of charge. All they have to do is install the equipment to capture it. Tidal power, there are commercial sources of tidal power as well. And France gets about 75% of its power from nuclear power. That's why the wildlife in France is making an enormous comeback, because the air pollution index has gone way down. Water is next. No water, no life. No water, no life. Love this poster. It's a fantastic play on words. If you put all the water together in one place and compare it to the amount of earth that there is, it's frighteningly small. And that's salt water. The big blue globe you see is salt water. The little blue globe, that's fresh water. And the little tiny, tiny, tiny blue globe, that's all the lakes and rivers in the world. 20% of the liquid fresh water on this planet is found in one place, Lake Baikal in Siberia. And the rest is up for us. Outdoor farming uses 70% of that water. The hydrological cycle is alive and well, but as I just said, most of it is used for agriculture. That big blue slice that you see there, that's agriculture. And it's just going to get worse as the climate changes, because if you're a farmer and you, let's say you grow wheat for a living, it's going to be very difficult for that farmer to move as conditions change, allowing the maximum wheat yields to be produced, let's say in Manitoba, rather than in North Dakota. So some farmers will lose and some farmers will gain, but eventually those farms will be up above the Arctic Circle if things continue the way they're going. In the United States, 3 states use over 50% of the liquid fresh water for agriculture. One of those states, of course, is California. Well, that used to be the case. California is in the 5th year of a serious drought. It's predicted that the El Nino effects this year will be so severe that California will probably wash away with all the excess water it will be receiving over the next 3 months. So you go from feast to famine to feast to famine. That's not a good business model either. So because of California's difficulties, thank you. I'm not here on Wednesdays, and you shouldn't try the veal. It's not very good, by the way. So California has its back up against the wall. So what is it doing? It's doing what it should be doing. It's doing what it should have been doing. It's recapturing water that it's used, and it's reusing it. So water really should be labeled a resource that's so valuable, it's too valuable to use it only once. In fact, you should use it again and again and again. Compared to California, New York City, right here, uses about 1 billion gallons of water per day. It's then treated in 14 different treatment plants and returned to the environment in the form of chlorinated gray water. Imagine if California's scheme of recovering water were applied to New York City's water supply. What would that do to the construction of tunnel number 3? Would it make it obsolete? Would we be able to sell that extra water that we could recover to a country that really desperately needed water, like any of the Middle Eastern countries? I wouldn't dare suggest, though, trading water for oil. You can drink water. But in California, they're already doing this. They're now recovering, at least in some places, and this is Santa Ana, California, they're recovering all of their gray water and turning it into drinking water, but no one would drink it because they knew where it came from. The yuck factor was too high for them. So the California governing bodies of Santa Ana elected to repercolate the aquifer uphill from where the towns drawing their water out of the ground were. And they say, oh, your water doesn't come from there. It comes from the ground, just like everybody else's. But of course that was, well, you get the idea. It's social marketing. So now we come to food. We've solved the energy problem, we've solved the water problem, now we can turn to food. Everybody eats. So the Biomimicry Institute in Missoula, Montana has issued this challenge to anybody interested in participating to globally design a food generating system that doesn't hurt the earth. Well, we've already done that, haven't we? At least I think we have. So insinuating urban agriculture into the city At first, 1999 looked like a pretty crazy idea, and in fact, people were objecting to it before they even heard about it by saying, well, the property is too expensive, and there's no sun, and there's no soil. All those things are true, but had nothing to do with the idea itself. But interesting criticism nonetheless, because you've got people that are willing to say no before they've even heard about the idea. And you know all those people out there. But as they did, it didn't hurt the concept because it got it into the public's eye. And so today we have many, many, many examples of urban agriculture, successful modern urban agriculture throughout the world. And believe it or not, I've actually got some maps to show you where those are. So this really fits in well with what's going on. So the enabling technologies are hydroponics, aeroponics, and aquaponics. If you want to go see one that uses hydroponics, just go to Brooklyn, go to the Gowanus Canal area, go in the Whole Foods market, and buy something that's green. Chances are it was grown on the roof by Gotham Greens. A very energized, publicly owned company that is now expanding their business into Queens and the Bronx, into much larger rooftops to fulfill the demand for fresh produce, 1-hour-old food. The vertical farm concept is based on a high-tech greenhouse approach, except that it's multiple stories. That's the basic difference. It's like saying, we want to go to the moon, and after World War II, the only thing we had to go on was V-2 rockets. That got us to the edge of the atmosphere. That's not good enough. Okay, maybe we need a 2-stage rocket. Most of those blew up on the launching pads, by the way, but the ones that actually made it into outer space enabled us to circle the Earth, but not to go to the moon. In order to get to the moon, you had to build a 3-stage rocket. In order to densify urban agriculture, you have to go from a 1-story building to a multiple-story building, just like you do to densify human populations from a single-family dwelling into a multiple apartment complex. So look what happened over the last, let's say, 6 years. If you go to the hardcover version of my book, I couldn't find a single example of an operational vertical farm, and that came out in 2010. It's only 5 years then. Japan, there's 145 of them. They call them plant factories, but they're higher than a single story. There's 45 of them in Taiwan. There are untold numbers in China, but we will never find that number out unless you actually go to every city and you look for yourself. We have a cluster of them in the Midwest. If that shows up, again, can I have the lights down on the board, please? I want those red dots to stand out because that's the way you're going to see where this actually is happening today. If you find yourself in Jackson, Wyoming over the next 3 months for the skiing, go visit the vertical farm that they're erecting right now. If you get to Hawaii, there's a vertical farm there too. They're going up in places where they're needed. That's first. So Japan needs them because it got a double whammy. We actually saw that one of the climate meetings that was talked about this morning was held in Sendai. I wonder why. Sendai is a farming community north of Tokyo, and when this meltdown occurred, 5% of the Japanese farmland disappeared in 1 hour. And it became radioactive shortly thereafter. People would not eat the food. They took their groceries up to the Geiger counter before they checked it out at the checkout counter. And if the ticker started to click, they just rejected the food. And several of them had that happen. Not many, but enough so that the word got out that they would not eat the food. And if you're the president of Japan, you better do something very quickly. So that's exactly what happened. They empowered Chiba University, where they were already developing this idea about vertical farming, into a technology that was rapidly applied to abandoned warehouses and sometimes new buildings as well. Today, Panasonic and Toshiba are partners in the vertical farming industries of Japan, just to show you how far that's come in such a short time. There's a place in Chicago called The Plant. It used to smoke meats like bacon and ham. When that industry collapsed because the stockyards disappeared, at the demand of the middle class of Chicago, by the way, because the smell was intense, this building was left pristine. John Edel moved into that building at the request of the mayor for $1 a year for the next 5 years and developed this concept so that they're raising tilapia that produce waste products that then feed the plants, that then clean the water that returns it to the tilapia. Not a bad idea, and you can actually go there. It's an NGO project. They don't make any money. It's a demonstration of how to do it in case you want to form a business on your own. But there are many others, and I had the pleasure of visiting the one in Korea when they first built it in 2009. It's next to their seed bank, which is about 10 times larger than that building. So if you want to know if the seeds are still alive in the seed bank, take them next door to the vertical farm and grow them. Don't you think that's a good idea for every country to have at least one of those? All the heirloom tomatoes and the asparagus and all those other plants that we think are not surviving as the result of the industrialization of our food supply could actually live a very happy life if we had seed banks to take care of the excess material to share with the rest of the world. Here's a short list of commercial vertical farms currently in existence. I won't read them for you, but you're all welcome to this PowerPoint, that's for sure. I can't tell you how proud I am of my students for convincing me to continue to use this as a project in class. That 3 years was enough for me. I'm not an expert at indoor farming or urban agriculture or anything else except parasitic diseases perhaps and laboratory work. So I've had to come up to speed as the result of their input. And all I had to do was just assign projects, and they went ahead and did the work. So I would love to take credit for all of this, but I certainly don't dare do that. This guy is making a lot of money, and he just got back from China, where he showed that government how to make 20 more of the one he has out in Portage, Indiana. Here's one they're building in Newark, New Jersey. So, the next time you come into New York, if you're not from New York and you want a cheap flight like JetBlue, you come into Newark, stop off in the Iron Band district for dinner, and I'm sure that the greens in your plate are going to come from Aerofarms, which will become the largest indoor farm, at least in the East. And they got a lot of their support from Goldman Sachs because they have a good business model. This sort of indicates that every one of the businesses that I showed you on that list where they're all highlighted in red, they're all in expansion mode. Every one of them is busy trying to find out who else wants this, and they've been successful at this. So it sounds almost too good to be true. I think if you say that, then it is too good to be true, so I won't use that phrase. I will just say that it's an idea whose time has come, and you're going to reap the benefits of that, because I think in another 3 to 5 years, virtually every city throughout the world will have examples of vertical farms and integrated farm systems. And it's because we can do that now with cheap LED lights that are highly efficient, that only give the wavelengths of light that the plants need to grow. And that only happened in the last 5 years. The reason why I know it works is this is Philips's experimental vertical farm that they're building on their property in Holland. A short list of all of those cities of the world that have something good about them with regards to the way the external environment is treated. Each one of these cities has a feature that if all of them were cobbled together into a single city, everyone would want to live there. Everybody would want to live there. You would want to raise your children there. You would want to call it home. It would be the most nurturing place on the planet. Can you imagine that? Sure you can. I didn't have to imagine it because I've visited a lot of these places. I just got back from Copenhagen, for instance, and they're not wrong. They're definitely not wrong in what they're doing. But they're not doing everything. They're not doing energy, water, food, commerce, recreation, parks, transportation. All of those things have to be integrated in a system that mimics the great outdoors. And when we learn, finally, how to do that, and I think we're very close to learning how to do that, then I think the Howard Hughes Corporation will want to build those cities. Here's the way Paris could look. I know that's been a tragedy in that city recently, right? They have a contest that they opened up to the world. It's called Re-Envisioning Paris. I was remarkably and humbly selected as one of the judges for the finalists. That will occur in January. How can you reimagine Paris after something that just happened, that just told you that this is never going to work here? You can't say that. You can't think like that. You have to be more positive about that. You can't take a criminal act against humanity as the reason why you're not doing something. But we do have choices. We can go to some of these for Christopher Tucker's apocalyptic view of what might happen if we don't pay attention until it's too late. All those citizens will be looking up to you and to other groups like you for guidance as to how to get out of this morass that we find ourselves in and come into balance with the world that gave rise to us to begin with. My view is that vertical farming will succeed and it will spread. And what I didn't tell you is that the ratio of production of crops indoors compared to the ratio of crops grown outdoors is about 10 to 1. So for one indoor acre, it's equivalent to about 10 outdoor acres. So if that's true, and you can raise them year-round without use of pesticides or herbicides, you have to use fertilizers, of course, then you can begin to contemplate giving land back to nature and allowing it to repair itself. So these damaged ecosystems will become more functional, and ecosystem services and functions will return to their, not their former self. That could never happen, but because a lot of us now choose to live in cities, it will happen more than it's happening now. And you can see what's happening in countries that have a return of their forests. Most of Western Europe have had a remarkable renaissance with regards to reforestation. The places that we wish it could happen are places like Brazil, where, of course, it hasn't happened yet. You saw the book. Sorry, I have to pander to my publisher. But thank you very much for listening.
So we have nice time for questions, but I'm actually going to ask you a few to start us off.
Please.
For many people, the idea of growing crops in the format that you're describing is a totally new, novel idea. And it might be helpful if you could explain a little bit more about the hydroponics and the aeroponics, sure, and how you actually practically do so, and what the range is of crops that it can be done with.
Well, that's a great question. We do meet again tomorrow, don't we?
Yes, we do.
Because this is a very long answer, and I'll give a very short answer to begin with, and that is that hydroponics is not as new as it sounds. It's an old technology that actually dates back to ancient times for some crops, particularly the crops that grew along the edges of lakes and rivers. It was systematically scientized, so to speak, broken down into its components and then put back together in optimum ways by some scientists at the University of California on the Davis campus. A man by the name of Gerreich actually published a book based on all of his investigations with his students called Soilless Agriculture. It was published in 1937. You can get a copy of it on Amazon. I have a copy. Apparently, a lot of people didn't believe that you could actually do that, so they turned their books back in or something, I don't know, but there's a lot of copies available still. You'll never guess what the first crop was that he demonstrated in the book using hydroponic technologies was. It was potatoes. Potatoes. Potatoes, the reason why he did that was because he wanted to prove to everybody's satisfaction that plants do not require soil to grow. If they did, and then you used up soil, eventually there'd be no more soil. That's not what fertilizer is. So they must be using something else. Soil is a matrix. So I know what some of you are thinking, but there's no terroir. You know, if there's no soil, there's no terroir. I totally agree with that. But if I haven't eaten in 2 or 3 days, Terroir, the hell with terroir. I could care less about terroir. I don't even know how to spell the damn word. I want food, and I want it to be healthy. So the way to do both of those things is to make a solution out of water, and that solution can be made from some crude material, like what's left over after you harvest the plants. You know, the stems and the roots and the leaves of plants that you don't eat. You could mash all that up and throw that into a big barrel of water and just let it rot. That's it, just let it rot. So when you take a glass of that and you hold it up to the light, it's a tinged color, it's got stuff in it. It's clear though because you've allowed it to settle. If you took that supernatant and fed that to plants, they'd go like crazy. It's like Miracle Grow. It's called a tea. So the hydroponic industry produces lots of teas. They recommend a tea for this or a tea for that. Kale has a particular formula for their tea. Corn has another formula for its tea, ideal tea, I should say. Or you can be very, what they would call unnatural. But everything we do is natural, so you can't do anything unnatural. There's no such thing as unnatural, unless a Martian comes and does it. So you can take chemicals off the shelf and make a mixture of all of the essential nutrients that plants and animals require and stir it all up like you do for Miracle Grow that you get at the plant store and feed that to the plants. So there are plenty of ways of delivering this nutrient solution to plants. One of them is just to float a styrofoam platform with holes drilled out. Little cups hold the plants hang their roots down into this soilless mixture of nutrients, and you have to aerate it to keep the root systems nice and happy. And you have to measure the pH so it's not too acidic and it's not too basic. It's just right. And there are machines that will do this now, so you can automate the whole process. And the next thing you know, you're growing kale, or you're growing, lettuce, or you're growing tomatoes, well, tomatoes won't grow like this. You have to do those as a vine vegetable. So the configuration of the hydroponic system is predicated on the way the plants grow outdoors as well. So green beans grow up like this, and tomatoes grow up like this, but, French breakfast radishes, which are grown by Green Spirit Farms in New Buffalo, Michigan, as one of their specialty crops. When you put them into a container that contains fiber from a coconut shell, and you start feeding it the nutrient solutions that it needs, the radish doesn't grow into the fiber. It actually pops up and sticks itself right out of the top of this. So all you have to do is cut it off, and you can take that home and eat it without having to wash it. It's so clean. So that's this new technology. And of course, you need to give sunlight and an organic source of nitrogen to the plants as well. So I've really come up to speed over the last 10 years, I think, because I've made a point of visiting all these places. And you can do this too. You can go to Gotham Greens in Brooklyn and ask to get a tour, and they'll give you a tour. Or you can go to Eurofresh Farms in Wilcox, Arizona, in the middle of a desert, and they'll show you how they grow their tomatoes. So there is nothing we can't grow hydroponically.
What about wheat, rice, the big commodities,
Sure.
the essential staples of global?
Yeah, the thing that jump-started the human evolution out of Africa, so to speak, the crops that we come to rely on now. There's no reason why we can't do it, but remember, these are businesses to begin with, so these people all started by pre-marketing in the local area to say in the restaurants and in the supermarkets, what are the leafy green vegetables that you sell the most of that are difficult to get? So over the last 5 years, let's say, most of these vertical farms have been producing crops that you would not consider to be part of the 4 main food groups, but will end up on your plate nonetheless as an addition to something else. The biggest crops, though, you're right, rice, wheat, barley, millet, quinoa, as I mentioned before. They can all be grown indoors. They can all be grown hydroponically or aeroponically. I don't know of any commercial versions of those, but I know a lot of demonstration projects because NASA has funded a lot of this essential research because those are the crops they would like to take somewhere else because you can grow them and store them. So go try to figure out why they had potatoes as the main crop for the movie The Martian. I don't get it. Potatoes are not very nutritious. And yet, that's all he had to grow, so he did to survive until they came to rescue him. But I think if I lived on Mars, I would like all of the grains so you could store them, and then some of the other crops that you can make nice meals with. So it depends on what you want and how much money you can get for them to begin with. But I think consumer demands will eventually filter down into these facilities, and they will be a one-stop shop just like most of the grocery stores are now.
I think at this point, I'd love to open up the floor for questions.
Yeah, Dickson?
Yeah.
Right, I'm over here.
Okay.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for a very stimulating presentation. I'm sure myself and many other members of the audience immensely enjoyed your stimulating presentation. I want to deliver a message to Al Gore because according to NPR yesterday, he has backed away from delivering coverage of the Paris event coming up in terms of, you know, something that affects all of us in the room, and we're very sensitive to the coverage. And when you just said that you can't take a criminal act against humanity as to why you can't do something, I want Al Gore to reconsider his backing away, to have the balls to step up to the plate, reverse his decision, go to Paris, and report on the most significant event that is happening in our lifetime. And that's the message I want to send to Al Gore and anybody else who wants to boycott the event in Paris. Your comments and your thoughts.
Well, you've said it all. I have actually spoken with Al Gore briefly at a meeting. He's got many good points that he makes about climate change. He is a spokesperson for that science, and I respect him for at the time that he started to speak about it, he was not a popular speaker. And so his Inconvenient Truth movie really hammered the point home. I don't know about his recent decisions, so I actually can't speak to that.
Other questions?
Thank you so much for your presentation. I just have some questions on how you think the best approach is to reaching out to countries like China, where like the majority of the land is already contaminated by heavy metals and other things, pollutants. How do you reach out to them to get them to understand, you know, how to do this or how important it is?
Sure. Well, we've already done that actually. That's a fantastic desire, because I think you want this to insinuate itself in places that have as an immediate application. So 5 years ago, I was at a meeting in Beijing called Innovating Metropolitan Agriculture, and you can actually go online and type those words out and get a sort of a readout of the meeting that was held. It was actually intended to be a meeting between the Netherlands and China. And the Secretary of Agriculture from the Netherlands and the Secretary of Agriculture from China actually met on stage during this week-long meeting and signed trade agreements, which would allow them to exchange information. Part of that information came from a university called Wageningen University. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it, but it's in eastern Holland, and it's the UC Davis of Europe, basically. It's got amazing agriculture, and it's particularly indoor agriculture. So I think they got the idea then, and I actually went to the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences after the meeting and talked with some other scientists, and they all got very excited about this. But then you don't hear anything. But then you do hear something. It's by rumor. Now, you know, Japan has 145 of these already. You think China would ever go to Japan and say, could you please show us how you're doing that? You know, we forgive all those horrible things you did to our country during the Second World War. We would love you to show us how to raise food. Of course they wouldn't. So instead, they came all the way to the United States, to Green Sense Farms, who apparently had a very good operation, robust operation, and asked them to go and show them how to do it. And that's going on now. I don't know how many others like that there are, but I think China will become a huge beneficiary for this technology because, as you point out, in 1700, there's this wonderful Chinese print of the harbor of Shanghai, and it shows Kunming Island, and it's a little spit of sand that's right in front of the harbor. Today, it's 160 miles long by 40 miles wide. That's the same island, and what is that island? It's all of the heartland of China's farming washed down into the harbor of Shanghai. And all those farmers that live in the central part of China, they have no more options. So I think that's why you're going to see this take off in China, as it did in Japan, for similar reasons. You know, when your resources are gone and you're technologically gifted, you invent new solutions to those problems. So, you know, necessity is the mother of invention, and it will be different for every place around the world, but everywhere those solutions are found, you can, because of the information highway that we now live on, you can put those together in very clever ways that makes good sense, like we saw in this wonderful documentary from MIT. I have a good friend up there also, his name is Caleb Harper, and he wants to let everybody try out vertical farming in a little box first for each plant species, and then he wants to open source the results so that everybody learns how to do this, so that no industry can actually capture that data and say, well, we'd love to show you how to do this. It'll cost you $5 billion in advance. And oh no, we want this to be open source. I think food needs to be taken off the economic table. That's my own opinion. I'm not a Marxist, I'm not a socialist, but I think we're the only species on the planet that charges for its food. Every other species gives it away. Even lions share with other lions. So why are we like this? Why do we get commercial when it comes to some essential ingredient of our lives? And
I think there's several other questions. Maybe we can try to
Sure.
answer a few more. I think this lady over here has had her hand up for a bit. Is there a mic? Can you bring her a mic?
There's somebody in the back that had their hand up, but maybe they were just waving to me.
Okay.
Where's the mic? Where is the person with the mic?
Don't know.
Okay, go ahead.
So I'm actually, my great passion environmental studies. So in the future, if we use a lot of ecosystem in the city to help to clean environment, no paper, if you use biofuel, that becomes cheaper in the cat.
I think I understood you to say that if we were to create ecosystems based on this idea, everything would become cheaper and more available. And I think that's absolutely true. It's interesting how we have perceived ecologically correct behavior as something negative. You know, I'm not a tree hugger, okay? Although my last name does mean apple trees, so you can hug this apple tree if you'd like. But I am connected to the rest of the natural world by some sequence of my DNA that says I'm a little bit like that tree, I'm a little bit like that bacteria, I'm a little bit like that butterfly. I'm a conglomeration, and I'm an assimilation of all of those traits. So to feel affinity towards the environment is a natural thing. To want to make it better is a natural thing, and not at the expense of anybody's life. So, I mean, I sound a little preachy, don't I? I think I should shut up about that.
Go ahead.
It's just how I feel, that's all.
I have a little difficulty imagining the harvesting of produce grown in that way. Would you describe the methods?
Sure. There are two options here. One is you can automate it, and the other is you can do it by hand. The Gotham Greens model is we are for full employment. So we want to hire people that come in, and we will teach you how to recognize a plant that's due for harvest. We will then allow you to go through this enormous facility, which is about the size of this room, and pick out the plants that are ready and package them up, and we'll ship them downstairs for sale. So that's one model. Or you can do it like Aerofarms. Aerofarms has a different model. They have rugs of growing matrix. And instead of planting one at a time, they take handfuls of germinated seeds of various green plants, and they just throw it all over the surface, more like you're making a pizza pie, and this is the mozzarella. All of those germinated seeds sort of sit down on a matrix. This is then put into a tray, underneath which are a series of nozzles that spray the nutrients up underneath. The root systems grow down, and that's called aeroponics. To harvest that, you just take the rug and put it on a platform and run it through the lawnmower. And the lawnmower actually shears off the crop just above the level of growth. You take it and evert it, and then invert it, shake it, take it back, grow it up again. You can do that 4 different times before you have to replant. So that was their model that they actually showed Goldman Sachs, and Goldman Sachs executives just sat there and they were absolutely amazed at what happens. But I think if you're interested in employing a lot of people, you should do it by hand. Just, you know, put everybody to work and then reward them for that work by allowing them to take some of that food home with them at night. It's not hard, though. It's not hard to do.
Thanks. I'm really struck by how this also can impact the carbon footprint around the transportation system in agriculture, because one of the things I think that we forget about is that especially certain kinds of crops are grown and then shipped thousands of miles away, oftentimes via aviation. So, but for some of those, they seem like they might be some of the most complicated ones to do in this way, such as fruits. So I'd be interested both in your thoughts there and also how we could use this to deal with some of those other flown crops, those things that have the shortest shelf life. Yeah. So the cut flower industry and the fruit tree industry seem to be 2 that come to mind in that regard.
Yeah, that's right. So fruit trees sequester carbon, and I wouldn't be in favor of growing those indoors. Those are okay to have orchards of apples and pears and peaches and apricots and things of this sort. The berry fruits, though, could easily be grown and are easily grown indoors. So we have a lot of blueberry, blackberry, raspberry type indoor farming. The carbon footprint is a great segue because I didn't have a slide for it, but I want to share with you this back of the envelope calculation, so take it from where it came from. Remember, I'm a microbiologist, so be kind to me. If every major city in the world grew 10% of its food needs, just 10%, the calculation is that you could save an outdoor equivalent of about 340,000 square miles of hardwood forest. That's how much that equals on a yearly basis. So 10% of the food produced by the world's cities could collectively save enough land outside to return to nature. And because most of those farms that we're familiar with, at least in our American Midwest and in other places throughout the world, and also in Brazil, used to be hardwood forests, and that's carbon sequestration. So you'll say, yeah, well, what about those poor farmers? I mean, what are you going to do about them? They become carbon farmers, and they're paid a premium for allowing the forest to grow back. In fact, they're paid much more money than they would have made as a farmer for corn or wheat or rye or any of those other products. So if you look at how much carbon 340,000 square miles of hardwood forest equals, let's say it's a 20 to 25-year-old forest, it's 3 times 10 to the 10th tons of carbon. If you remove that much carbon from the atmosphere, if the needle is pointing to 400 parts per million right now, the needle will go all the way back to 1987. We could, in 20 years, reverse the rapidity of climate change simply by encouraging the regrowth of forests. And FAO says this every single year that they have a final report. This is the simplest, easiest, dumbest, cost-free activity that you could possibly imagine doing. But, of course, we have to farm. So that's why the forests are being cut down. So my book, I won't write it down for you, but I'll tell it to you anyway. It's called The Man Who Planted Trees. It's a book. It's a real book. And it's written by John Giano. And it follows the life of a man who is 47 years old when he's encountered by a hiker in the south of France. And this old, now not so old man plants 100 trees every day, acorns. He does this for the rest of his life until he's 82 years old. So if you have a calculator near you, how many trees is that? It's in the millions. The man ended up owning a forest. So that one person doing something can really matter in this sense.
I think on that note, we will conclude the session, but I want to thank you very much for making us really rethink farming and crop growing. And thank you for coming today, and thank you all for listening.
My pleasure.